November 1st of 1963, 21 days before the president's assassination, November 1st, 1963, 21 days before the president's assassination, the South Vietnamese military acted and they overthrew all of the sitting leaders of the South Vietnamese government, including Prime Minister Diem. The problem was, for Kennedy, is they did not exile him out of the country. They executed him and his brother, who was also in the top echelons of the South Vietnamese government. So the South Vietnamese military didn't live up to their end of the bargain with American support. They didn't exile Diem out of the country. They executed him and his brother. Well, Kennedy was absolutely shocked because this is not what the deal was, and that wasn't what he was supporting. And you can imagine, after the assassination of Prime Minister Diem, what did the military want President Kennedy to do? No, opposite. Send military troops in to support the South Vietnamese military, now that they had control. And he's getting heat from the military, Kennedy is. He's getting heat from Secretary of State Dean Rusk, McGeorge Bundy, remember him from the Cuban Missile Crisis? They're all saying, we can't let South Vietnam fall. It'll endanger all of Southeast Asia. And they're just arguing like crazy. The military, Secretary of State Rusk, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, President Kennedy, you've got to send troops in. You got to send troops in. You got to send troops in. You can't let South Vietnam fall. You cannot do this. It'll change and endanger all of Southeast Asia. So who does Kennedy turn to that he believes will give him a non-biased, relaxed, honest answer? No. You're getting closer. No. Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana. Trusted friend. So Kennedy turns to Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana. And the reason why he turns to Mansfield is he trusts him, he's a friend, and Mansfield took a trip where? To Vietnam to study things recently. Okay? So Kennedy turns to Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana, who knew the region of Vietnam well. And this is what he told the president when he asked him, and I want you to write this down. This is what Mansfield said to President Kennedy. He said, quote, "It's a quagmire." That's spelled Quagmire. It's a quagmire. Quagmire. Mansfield says to Kennedy, it's a quagmire. If you go in with an army, you'll never get out. Boy, was he ever right. Senator Mansfield knew the region of Vietnam well, and he told President Kennedy, quote, "It's a quagmire. If you go in with an army, you'll never get out." It's like walking in quicksand. It's like a mud hole. Now, President Kennedy listened to his advisors, he listened to the military, he listened to Rusk, he listened to McGeorge Bundy, he listened to Mansfield, and historians tell you that he probably would have leaned towards non-commitment of troops. Problem was, his final decision would never be known, because 2-3 weeks later, he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. So President Kennedy, according to historians, would lean towards non-commitment. That was their belief after all the research. But unfortunately, a decision would never be made because he was assassinated 3 weeks later. Yep.
Did LBJ turn to his cabinet as much as Kennedy did?
Not quite as much. No, not quite as much. Yes, dear?
It did, with his assassination, did that have like conspiracy theories and stuff that happened with Vietnam too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, it did. Now, here's what I want you to write down. After the assassination of President Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson made it very clear publicly what his plan for Vietnam was. Okay? That's an interesting question. After the assassination of President Kennedy, Johnson publicly stated his intentions on Vietnam. This is what he said publicly on what his plan was for Vietnam. He said this, quote, "I'm not going to be the president who saw Vietnam go the way China went." This is what he said after he assumed office concerning Vietnam. "I am not going to be the president who saw Vietnam go the way China went. I am not going to be the president who saw Vietnam go the way China went." What's he saying there, Brian? He's going to send the military. He's going to do that. Now, here's something to just listen to. Historians have stated that in 1963, President Kennedy could have never imagined what the United States was doing in Vietnam by 1973. He would have fell over his grave and we'll get to that. But in that 10-year period, from the time that he was going to make the decision to non-commit troops to 1973, when this mess is over, Kennedy would have just rolled over in his grave if he'd have seen what happened. And you're going to hear about what happened throughout this lecture. But keep in mind, it was Kennedy's intention not to send troops to Vietnam. It is their war to win. In the end, they're the ones that have to win. Is that what he said? Now, this is a pretty interesting book here, written by Jeff Greenfield, called "If Kennedy Lived." What do you need? One more.
Oh, the end of the book.
Okay, I am not going to be the president who saw Vietnam go the way China went. Now, this book is an interesting book. It was written by Jeff Greenfield and was called "If Kennedy Lived." And it talks about what would have happened in the instance that he would not have been assassinated. Well, I want to read something from this book about Vietnam, and I think it's very proficient that you hear this. Here's what it says. In South Vietnam, for almost 3 years, his advisors had been giving him such conflicting advice that he had once asked 2 of them, "Are you sure we're talking about the same country here? Is the South Vietnamese army, with the help of 15,000 American advisors, making any headway against the Viet Cong guerrillas? Is the government of Ngo Dinh Diem winning the hearts and minds of the people?" Diem and his brother had seemed more interested in suppressing the majority than dealing with the corruption and incompetence in their government. And while his Joint Chiefs in Ruskin State and Bundy in the White House were telling him, "We can't let South Vietnam fall, it will endanger all of Southeast Asia," others, Keith Galbraith, his Indian ambassador, in other words, his ambassador from India, Senator Mike Mansfield, who knew the region, and General Charles de Gaulle of France were telling him, "It's a quagmire. If you go in with an army, you'll never get out." His own George Ball had said flatly that if the United States went in with ground troops, it would have 300,000 or more in a year or 2. That idea was nuts, of course, he told George that, but still, they had over 500,000 in there. He predicted less than what was there. As for his own instincts, well, just yesterday in Washington, at the end of a meeting with a young State Department aide, he'd beckoned him back to his Oval Office. "Wait a minute," he said to the aide. "After the first of the year, I want you to organize an in-depth study of every possible option we've got in Vietnam, including how to get out. We have to review this whole thing from the bottom to the top." But he was also a man of finely honed political instincts, and they told him he couldn't cut his losses now, even if he wanted to. Not with an election coming up, not with the prospect that the Republicans would yell, "Who lost Vietnam?" just the way they and a lot of Democrats yelled, "Who lost China?" at Truman back in 1949. Hell, as a young congressman, he had been one of them that said, "Who lost China?" to Truman. So politically, he knew he was in a little bit of a pickle. That's why he told Kenneth O'Donnell, Mike Mansfield and everyone else that nothing was going to happen until after he was re-elected. For God's sake, all anyone had to do was look at the full-page ad in the Dallas Morning News, bordered in black and paid for by H.L. Hunt and a group of Dallas businessmen on the far right, more or less accusing him of treason. Remember the picture? So what was Kennedy going to do concerning committing troops to Vietnam? He wasn't going to make a decision till after the re-election in 1964. And historians will tell you if he was re-elected in 64, which was not a given, by the way, because some of the things concerning women and those types of things were coming out, and Bobby Kennedy was trying to put out the fires as fast as they were brewing up so his brother could get re-elected. So there's some question there. Okay? George Romney may have been a political opponent in that election. Nelson Rockefeller. And Kennedy was not assured that that was going to happen. But the point being, in essence, what I want you to know about this is that most historians say if President Kennedy stays in office, whether he's re-elected or not, we are not committed to Vietnam as we're going to be committed in just a few moments. Okay? All right, last thing we're going to talk about today, and probably the saddest piece of legislation ever passed by an American Congress, is President Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This is probably the worst piece of legislation that the American Congress has passed, in my opinion, in American history. President Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Well, in the summer of 1964, one single event led to the escalation of American involvement in Vietnam that would never turn around, never turn back. We would, from this point on, be escalating to the maximum. Remember, it's a quagmire. If you send troops in, you will never get out. This was the start of it. Summer of 1964. One single event led to the escalation of American involvement in Vietnam that would never stop. On August 2nd, 1964, August 2nd, 1964, an American battleship called the USS Maddox, quote, reportedly exchanged gunfire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats. On August 2nd, 1964, an American battleship called the USS Maddox reportedly exchanged gunfire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Where did this exchange occur? In the Gulf of Tonkin, which was along the coast of North Vietnam. So supposedly, the USS Maddox exchanged torpedo fire, or gunfire, excuse me, with torpedo boats from North Vietnam, off the coast of North Vietnam, in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Johnson gets word of this exchange, and he makes arrangements to appear on national television to speak to the American people. So when President Johnson gets word of this exchange between the USS Maddox and North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, he makes arrangements to speak to the American people on national television. And he does that on August 4th, 2 days later. He's going to appear on national television. And what's he going to tell people about? This gross attack by these North Vietnamese torpedo boats upon an American battleship called the USS Maddox. Now, he tells the people in his national address that the actions on part of the North Vietnamese are an act of war. He tells the American people that these actions by the North Vietnamese torpedo boats upon the USS Maddox are an act of war. And then he informs the people that he's going to ask Congress to grant him full authority to take whatever actions needed against the North Vietnamese. He tells the American people that he will be asking Congress to grant him full authority to take any actions needed against North Vietnam. Three days later, on August 7th, Congress passes the infamous Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. 3 days later, on August 7th, 1964, Congress adopts the infamous Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. I want you to listen to what it said. Just don't write it down, listen, and tell me what you perceive here. So, by passing of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7th of 1964, this is what President Johnson is granted. Okay? The full power to, quote, take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. What are they giving him permission to do? Anything he wants concerning Vietnam and against the North. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution granted President Johnson the full power to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. This passes 414 to 0 in the House, and it passes 88 to 2 in the Senate. Who were the two senators that voted against it? No, actually he did not. Ernest Gruing of Alaska, and this fella right here, Wayne Morris of Oregon, were the only two senators to vote against the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. I'm amazed that Mansfield voted for it. Amazed, but he did. So the two senators who voted against the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution were Ernest Gruing of Alaska and Wayne Morris of Oregon.
Why don't they just kind of make a formal declaration of war?
Okay.
Pretty much the same.
This is why you are awesome. Because let me tell you what Wayne Morris said after he voted no. This is what's got Sully's awesome. He said, you don't have to write this down, but this is what he said. Now think about what he's saying here. This is what Morris says after he votes. He says, we are in effect giving the president war-making powers in the absence of a declaration of war. I believe this to be a historical mistake. And he was absolutely right. Thank you, Sully. Again, Wayne Morris said, we are in effect giving the president war-making powers in the absence of a declaration of war. I believe this to be a historic mistake. You're exactly right. Why didn't we? What we did instead is we gave him the entire power to do anything he wanted without a declaration of war.
Is that
And in
what we still don't? Like, the last declaration of war that we had, wasn't that like World War II? Is this the same big reason why
Yeah.
we still end up going to declaring war since?
You know, I'm not sure, but this was a huge, huge mistake. And like I mentioned, at one time in this war, we're going to have 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. Okay, tomorrow we'll talk about the American and South Vietnamese strategy in the war and kind of move on from there. But we are sucked in now. The thing I want you to remember the most about today's lecture is the chances of us having a Vietnam and the chances of us having a Vietnam Wall, which you will visit, would have been a lot slimmer if President Kennedy would have not been assassinated in Dallas. History changes. Lee Harvey Oswald didn't realize what he was going to change historically.